they had to go on to an almost complete and total war footing immediately. You know, when I was in Kobani a few years ago, meeting with people who stayed in the city during the siege, as well as people from the YPG, the YPJ, and the SDF who fought in Kobani, the efforts to evacuate civilians, prepare the defense, and fight, you know, street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood. Sometimes they were saying, you know, between the walls and floors of the same apartment buildings against ISIS. All of their efforts had to be dedicated to this effort to defend their people and ensure that they could survive. But all the while from 2014 onward, as the YPG, the YPJ, and their allies won victories against ISIS, and as the autonomous administration expanded, they worked on implementing the principles of this first social contract wherever they went. And so what did that mean? That meant pluralism, religious freedom, respect for the multiple languages and ethnicities of Northeast Syria. You know, I would meet in Northeast Syria Kurds, Syriac Assyrian Christians, Arabs, people of all different backgrounds who were proud to say that their organizations had participated in drafting the social contract. I met women from the Syriac Women's Union in Hasaka who said that they, along with Kurdish women, were very proud of the fact that the feminist innovations in the social contract had come from the participation of women of many different communities. So that commitment to pluralism, you know, recognizing all the religions of Northeast Syria, the right to change one's religion, have no religion at all, establishing 3 official languages in Syria before the war. The only official language recognized in Syria was Arabic, even though many peoples in Northeast Syria, particularly the Kurds, spoke different languages. The new social contract established a multilingual system. The new autonomous administration in all 3 cantons established in 2014 had 3 official languages: Kurdish, Arabic, and Aramaic. When you see street signs in cities across Northeast Syria, you'll see all of those languages and more, because other local languages are also given co-official status in areas where they're spoken. And of course, in private homes, private businesses, publications, people can use any language they like. So that commitment to pluralism was there. Gender equality, and going really beyond gender equality to a commitment to women's liberation, was also a principle that was in there from the beginning. The first social contract recognized women's freedom and the role of women. Women participated in writing it and implementing it. Women were there from the very beginning in the autonomous administration's institutions. And when they got into those institutions and were able to exercise political power and build power for women as, you know, a collective for all of the women in society, they used what they had to expand those efforts. You know, we've all seen the women who fought on the front lines in Northeast Syria from the very beginning, but what a lot of people don't know is at that same time, women were participating in drafting the first social contract, in leading the governments and local administrations in Kobani, Afrin, and Jazeera after they declared autonomy, and in organizing women through autonomous women's organizations like Congress Star to insist on women's freedom in all areas of life. So these principles that Rojava and North and East Syria are famous for were there in that first social contract from the beginning. But like I said, there also was crisis from the very beginning as well. There was the complete uncertainty of the whole situation in Syria, and then specifically the war against the Islamic State. And, you know, when you look through the next several years of Northeast Syria's history and the history of the development of their political institutions, you can see that that existential conflict was at the very center of it. That created a lot of challenges for North and East Syria, having to fight a group like ISIS with very limited resources, having to, you know, protect their people, defend their Kurdish, Christian, Yazidi communities in the region from a group that sought to eradicate them. We all know that over the course of the war against ISIS, the Syrian Democratic Forces lost in total more than 10,000 people who gave their lives to liberate the region. So this involved many sacrifices and many difficulties, but it also presented opportunities because, again, everywhere that the YPG, the YPJ, and later the SDF liberated, they set up local administrations expanding on the principles of this radical new social contract that they came out with in 2014. This allowed them to bring more and more new communities into their political project. When they liberated cities like Manbij, which is a mixed city with an Arab majority and a significant Kurdish minority, other minorities as well, they were able to say convincingly that their project wasn't just a Kurdish project. It was a project for the local people of that city, that region, and of every city. You know, some of the most proud defenders of the women's liberationist element of the revolution in Northeast Syria are women in cities like Raqqa and Manbij, who, when I would meet with them, would talk about their lives before the war, the terror of living under ISIS, of trying to keep themselves and their loved ones safe in areas occupied by such a terrible extremist group. And then after the liberation, realizing that not only were they free from ISIS occupation, but they as women could be free in a new way too, because they saw what the women of the YPJ, of Congresstar, of the autonomous administration had done in their areas and thought, well, if those women can stand up, organize themselves, defend their communities, struggle for freedom, so can we. And these women now are active participants in the political and social life of their regions. Many of them were involved, and many of their autonomous women's institutions were involved in writing this new social contract as well. So these victories over ISIS allowed these ideas to spread and gave the people in Northeast Syria a chance at participating in building an alternative to what they had gone through under the Syrian regime and what they had suffered living under ISIS rule for many years. So in 2017, the sort of most famous victory over ISIS, the liberation of Raqqa, which ISIS had taken as its de facto capital, occurred. And after that point in time, a lot of the situation in Northeast Syria became more complicated because Turkey intervened for the first time. Raqqa was liberated in October 2017. In January of 2018, Turkey invaded and began its attempt to occupy Afrin. In March of 2018, Turkey occupied Afrin completely. Unfortunately, to this day, it remains there. And at that point, as these major victories over ISIS had been won, Northeast Syria was trying to set itself on a path of shifting away from this focus on existential total war for their very survival against these extremist groups and towards developing the social and political aspects of their revolution. The fall of 2017 was actually when Northeast Syria had its last elections, and in late 2016 and into 2017 was when the next social contract, building on the 2014 social contract, was introduced. So at that point in time, it was the social contract of the Democratic Federation of Northern Syria. And in the fall of 2017, you know, with that social contract in place, election laws had came out and elections were held at the local level. The plan was for elections to be held across the entire region under the autonomous administration and the SDF in late 2017 and early 2018. But with the invasion and occupation of Afrin and very real fears that Turkey was about to go even further and occupy more territory, that became impossible due to the security conditions. And then, as we all remember, in late 2018, just a few months after Turkey had taken full control of Afrin, US President at the time, Donald Trump, said that the US would be withdrawing forces from Syria. That prompted Turkey to begin to threaten to invade. That forced the what we can call the safe zone process, wherein the US and Turkey negotiated over the future of Northeast Syria. As a lot of you might remember at that time, instead of addressing the roots of the Kurdish question in Turkey and the reasons why Turkey's far-right nationalistic government was threatening the Syrian Kurds and all the peoples of Northeast Syria, the United States decided to ignore the very open and public messaging from the Kurdish movement and the recommendations of many experts, human rights activists, policy practitioners, activists, people of all walks of life who were saying that a peace process was the option. And again, as I mentioned, the messaging from the Kurdish movement itself that they would be willing to engage in a broader return to peace talks with Turkey. The US went for this so-called safe zone agreement, which as soon as Turkey saw the opportunity and US politics created the correct conditions, Turkey violated that agreement and invaded and occupied Serikaniye and Tel Abyad. Again, like the invasion and occupation of Afrin, displacing hundreds of thousands of people, involving war crimes against the Kurdish population, the Christian and Yazidi population, the other ethnic and religious minorities, women, anyone seen as being supportive of the autonomous administration. And although this occupation was stopped and contained to those two cities, it had a very devastating effect on their population. Like the people of Afrin, many of them remain displaced. The autonomous administration doesn't have the resources to meet their needs. And in the areas along the front lines, you know, my most recent time in Syria, I was in Ain Issa and Tel Tamer, which if you look at the front line, if it's like that, it's sort of the two bottom corners of the area that Turkey occupies. And these cities are shells of their former selves. Many people have left. Many of those who stay are those who have no option but to stay. You can see the damage from drone strikes and shelling on civilian homes. You can see the damage to infrastructure. You can see people who are afraid to go out to their farms and their agricultural land because of the risk that that might be targeted. It's a very, very difficult situation in these areas. There's supposed to be a US brokered ceasefire and a Russian brokered ceasefire. But what I heard time and time again from people in the ceasefire zones is that there is no ceasefire, and that people believe that the US and Russia, while they might have stopped Turkey from taking more territory, they haven't stopped Turkey from doing basically every other kind of military, economic, environmental action short of a ground war in order to weaken the administration and really threaten the people of North and East Syria. And they see this as violations of the spirit of the ceasefire agreement, and certainly of any stated Russian or American commitment to ensuring stability via those ceasefires. So there was a lot of frustration with those guarantor powers and their commitment to those agreements. And so after 2019, with this very unstable, quote unquote, ceasefire situation going in, again, it was a time of a lot of uncertainty and security challenges for Northeast Syria. But eventually, the sense started to appear and really prevail among the communities there, among leaders in the administration, amongst people dealing with these problems, that the conflict couldn't continue to be an excuse for the failure to develop politically and socially. And that political and social stagnation and failing to improve and develop institutions to meet the needs of the people in the region and address real criticisms and complaints that people had in their system, that the failure to make those changes and move forward because of the incredibly difficult military situation couldn't be accepted any longer. And that in fact, not making political change and not developing the revolution under difficult circumstances, like they had done from the very beginning of the project, would actually lead to even greater weaknesses and even more challenges in the realm of military and security threats than making the hard choice to continue to develop under those conditions anyway. So with that scenario in mind and those concerns in mind, in 2020, the Syrian Democratic Council began to hold a series of people's meetings, meeting with the community, with leaders, with civil society, to discuss their concerns, grievances, comments, views on what the administration had been doing. And as a result of those meetings, which were held in Jazeera and Hasaka and other regions, the SDC convened a national conference. And out of these meetings and these consultations came the decision that Northeast Syria needed a new social contract that would include all of the territory currently under AANES and SDF control, and that would be adapted to the realities of the situation that they were in. And so as part of that process, they created a small specialized drafting committee of 30 people and a larger committee of, I think, between 150 and 160 people. Now, those committees worked on preparing a draft. They met with people, different autonomous administrations brought draft ideas and texts to people. I met members of this drafting committee in the fall of 2021 when I was there, who talked about debating and discussing and having a real consultative process on what would go in. They used the previous social contracts as an inspiration. They also looked to the constitutions of federal systems, pluralist systems in states around the world, You know, as much as opponents of the autonomous administration try to say that federalism, democracy, decentralization, you know, constitutes separatism, which they don't, or might threaten the stability of Syria, which they don't. If you look around the world, you know, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in North and South America, there are many prosperous, stable countries that have federal systems, that have multiple official languages. So they looked at these two, they looked at their own experience, and they looked at the issues and criticisms and complaints that people had made and the problems that had come up, you know, in their own experience, leading institutions and participating in governance through the past several years of building the project. At some points, the security situation meant that these consultative meetings were slowed. When you think about it, right, especially as Turkey's drone war picked up with the assassinations of SDF and autonomous administration leaders, and even civilian civil society activists who just seemed to be pro-autonomous administration or who had family members who participated in their institutions. This kind of direct political work with the society was something that was very dangerous for political leaders and for civilians themselves. So although this process was slow, it went on. And eventually in December, the committee met for several days in Raqqa to debate and discuss a final draft of the social contract. That draft was then prepared, submitted to the Executive Council of the Autonomous Administration. And in December of last year, the new social contract of what's now the Democratic Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria was approved. So the whole process, while what I've heard from my conversations with people involved in drafting it, people involved in building those institutions, in a lot of ways, it was very inclusive and participatory. They involved people from different autonomous administration institutions, from political parties, from women's organizations, from organizations representing different ethnic and religious groups. You know, the committee, I think, in a first time in world history for any constitution, was made up of 50% men and 50% women. And what I heard speaking to women on the committee was they felt that their participation was just as valued as anyone else, that their ability to represent not only themselves, but a collective women's institutions was strong. And when we get into a little bit later what's in the social contract, you'll see that played out in practice. You know, they weren't just in the room in terms of representation, but they were able to put some of their priorities into that document and build on what previous social contracts had done to actually advance the status of women. So in some ways, it was very participatory, very, you know, democratic in the way that they wanted it to be. But in other ways, they will admit, even, you know, in my conversations with leaders who've worked on it, that they could have done better. You know, their plan at one point was to hold a referendum for public approval of the social contract. But under these conditions, with Turkish bombardment, with severely reduced access to services, with the threat of new Turkish military intervention, the security conditions just didn't make it feasible to develop an entire referendum process and have the entire social contract be voted on. And so when, you know, talking to people involved in the process about the shortcomings, that was one thing that they said that they wished that they could have done, but didn't get the opportunity to do. Now, in the new text itself, you can see that this is a document that is responding to the state of crisis that North and East Syria has found itself in, that is maintaining commitments to the basic revolutionary values that the revolution in Rojava in North and East Syria has always been based on, and that casts itself not only as an immediate solution to the region's problems, but as an aspirational model for a future democratic, united Syria, representing not just the Northeast, but all Syrians. So like previous social contracts, it recognizes that Northeast Syria is a part of Syria and that it aspires to be a model for a future decentralized, democratic, and multi-ethnic Syrian republic. It recognizes religious freedom, pluralism, multiple languages, the freedom of women, all of these values that come from the Kurdish movement's democratic confederalist paradigm, and that have been really central to North and East Syria's not just political project, but experience as a very diverse region, as a region where people from all communities, you know, where men and women all participated and sacrificed so much in the fight against ISIS together. All of those values that have been, you know, institutionalized in previous social contracts are put in there. So they're not stepping away from their revolutionary commitments. In some other ways, the social contract actually advances on a lot of the provisions and practices that were in previous social contracts. And in that way, I think they're learning the lessons of what's been seen on the ground. One interesting provision is the provision on referendums. So within this new social contract, any region or city or municipality or any administrative unit below the level of the autonomous administration as a whole has the ability to hold a referendum if it opposes any autonomous administration-wide decision. And if that referendum passes, they actually will have the ability to repeal that decision, so long as their decision that they're making, the referendum that they're holding, the result that they want is, you know, in alignment with the basic principles of the social contract. And there will be a court that will decide on those cases per another article of the document. But what this means essentially is that if one town in the entire autonomous administration of Northeast Syria doesn't agree with the decision that the autonomous administration has made at a higher level, that town can put it to a democratic referendum. And if the majority of the people vote to decide, they'll be able to, at their administrative unit, reverse that decision. This, a lot of people have argued, and, you know, based on conversations being had about it, it looks like this is one of their attempts to respond to situations in places like Deir ez-Zor, which is a very conservative Arab majority region, one of the last areas to be liberated from ISIS, where people have had real grievances and disagreements with the autonomous administration, and where the practices of the administration and the SDF have been heavy-handed and have been criticized for deviating from the values that the administration wants to hold. And again, this is a very complex situation. The security situation there is incredibly difficult. You have the Syrian regime, Iran, Turkey trying to stir up chaos. You have ISIS remnants still there. It was one of the regions where, unlike places like Kobani and Kamishlo, you did actually have local communities supporting and joining ISIS themselves. So it's not a simple situation at all, but there have been legitimate complaints that people there have made, and something like this referendum system would allow that region and smaller towns and communities within it to be able to make their own choices and have more of a say in the governance of their own regions in a way that could take away some of the issues that outside actors like ISIS, like Turkey, like Iran use to create chaos and threaten the autonomous administration. So that's one very interesting step, and something that could address both governance issues, you know, making the system more democratic in line with its stated values, but also help address security problems by, you know, reducing the causes that bad actors can exploit. Another very interesting step in the social contract and the discussions around it is the fact that it makes an explicit mention of elections. So again, the last elections that Northeast Syria held were in 2017. They weren't able to hold the final level of those elections due to the invasion of Afrin. And so since then, it's been 5-6 years that they have not had elections, which by their own standards and by their own goals and desires for their system was not an outcome that a lot of people there wanted. And so these new elections are something that people are very excited about and show a real advancement in being, you know, not only democratic through participatory institutions, through grassroots democracy, through participation in, you know, local level neighborhood institutions, women's movements, and so on, but democratic in the sense of holding these elections and allowing people to choose their leaders. Based on the conversations that I've been having with people who are informed on these issues from the SDC, the administration, the SDF, the plan is for at least local and municipal elections to be held within the year. I'm not sure, based on what I've heard, when the region-wide elections will be held, but it's my understanding that to hold the elections and to hold them at a standard that will be respected and supported, and that is worth the effort that they've put into it. They're working right now on developing electoral laws, getting the institutional capacity to be able to organize such a process, and all of the other work that needs to go into place to make elections physically possible. Of course, they also, any kind of political development needs basic physical security, and then basic resources necessary to human life. So obviously in this current situation, with severe deficiencies in fuel and heat and clean water, and with Turkey threatening a ground operation, this is something that's going to be extremely difficult. But one thing I heard time and time again from people in military structures and political structures of all different perspectives is they don't want to allow those difficulties to prevent them from pursuing what they see as the goal of their revolution, which is the development of an alternative system, of something that can stand on its own, in contrary to religious extremists, to ultra-nationalists, to this entire model of, repressive nation states that they view as the root of these problems in the Middle East. That was never going to be an easy alternative to build. Nobody there ever believed that it would be an easy alternative to build. And, building it under these conditions, I believe they expected that they would have many adversaries who were trying to prevent them from doing just that. I was talking to a few people doing some interviews about the social contract. And one of the questions that I asked was, hey, every time Northeast Syria does something to improve the lives of its people, whether that's successfully getting sanctions removed by the US back a year and a half ago, whether that is liberating areas from ISIS, any of these political, military, economic developments that have occurred have always been followed with Turkish threats, right? They liberate Raqqa and then Turkey goes in for Afrin. In 2022, sanctions are lifted, and the day that sanctions were lifted, almost hours after that, you have Turkish President Erdogan threatening to invade Northeast Syria. Why is he doing that? Because who's going to invest or start a business or a farm or a factory or anything that you could think of if they believe that, whatever they create will be destroyed, if workers don't want to work there because they don't believe it's safe? So the security situation, sort of precluded immediately any chance of the lifting of these, very difficult sanctions from having any kind of impact. And now we're seeing that after they announce this social contract and start the practical work of planning to hold elections to align with it, Turkey starts with these campaigns of airstrikes. And I want to reiterate again that this is almost exclusively against the civilian population of Northeast Syria. Turkey has fighter jets, Turkey has drones, Turkey has the capability, if they wanted to strike military targets. We know that they know where those military targets are. We know that they know where the front lines are, but that is not what is being hit. Thankfully and remarkably, there have been relatively few direct casualties and relatively few, in particular, military and security casualties. Obviously, this is a good thing. And it shows that, Turkey is not pursuing the same kind of war that it pursued in 2018 and 2019, where it was engaging military forces in order to occupy and invade territory. They are targeting oil fields, they are targeting power generators, they are targeting water stations, they're targeting farms and factories. They are targeting the basic infrastructure that people need to live. What I've been seeing, from friends and contacts in the region, people don't know where they're going to get fuel to heat their homes or cook food when their supplies run out. People are being disconnected from the internet. They'll write after a couple of days and say, I'm okay, I was fine. We just didn't know when we'd get internet access. I couldn't write to you. I couldn't write to anyone. It's an extremely difficult situation. It is targeted explicitly to impact the civilian population of Northeast Syria. Turkey's goal has always been to not only crush the administration and the SDF, but to displace all of the people living in Northeast Syria out of the region forever so that there would be no social base for Kurdish autonomy. and particularly no social base for a project like they are pursuing, a revolutionary project like they're pursuing with the autonomous administration. Because if you look at this new social contract and you see their commitment to a democratic, federal, multi-ethnic Syria representing all of the communities that live there, if you see all of the articles devoted to things like pluralism, religious freedom, the freedom of women, if you see their democratic processes, their efforts to, instead of, as there have been these trends with the war to make a more centralized system, sort of against what they believe, things like the referendum system work towards decentralization, towards giving more of that power back to communities in a way that might be more effective than pre-existing decentralized institutions. Everything that you see in this document, everything about the process by which it was written through consultations and debate, including men and women, including people of different communities and different backgrounds, all of this is an effort to not just stay at the level at which they were, but to actually advance the values of the revolution in Northeast Syria and of the movements that it is inspired by. And Turkey knows that if they can do this in North and East Syria, then people in Turkey, in any other country, and not just Kurds, but any oppressed community, could take a similar anti-statist, anti-ultranationalist, anti-fundamentalist, pro-decentralization, pro-women's freedom, pro-freedom and coexistence of all people position, implement it, and that would be an end to these conflicts that have not just destabilized the entire region and caused so much human suffering, but that have empowered people like Erdogan, parties like the AKP, like the MHP, the far-right party that he's in coalition with. If they can do an alternative to this in Northeast Syria and make it work, then every ultra-nationalist, every religious fundamentalist, every leader occupying and waging war to distract from problems at home, all of these leaders, all of these states in the region will have their work cut out for them, because this alternative that they're building in Northeast Syria is something that could challenge that. And the fact that it has persisted under these conditions shows a willingness to learn from its own mistakes and shortcomings and address problems that it's faced and do better than it's done in the past. I think is a sign, not that it's weaker, but actually that it's stronger. So I think even in this very difficult time for the people of Northeast Syria, that this insistence on political and social development is an incredibly revolutionary step. I hope to see it implemented, as best that it can. I think that successful implementation will show the value of this project and its ability to continue to improve and develop. And I think that the most important thing that we can do as people who study this region, who support the people and communities of this region, to make sure that it can be implemented and that these political changes and developments can happen and that this revolution can be developed, is to give them the basic conditions under which this is all possible, right? We need to be screaming as loud as we possibly can, advocating in whatever ways work best for us and our capabilities and our situation for an end to Turkey's war on the Kurdish people, a political solution to the Kurdish question in Turkey, particularly in countries like the US, where I am right now, an end for our government's support for Turkey's war, which includes things like arms sales, intelligence cooperation, the designation of Kurdish groups as terrorists, all kinds of political and diplomatic support, making sure that our governments are not helping Turkey do this, because what people in Kurdistan have told me again and again, and what I truly believe in my capacity as a researcher, is that if the US, Europe, NATO, all of these countries were not supporting the Turkish government's war on the Kurdish people, Turkey would not be able to do this. These drones and these fighter jets that they use to bomb the infrastructure of Northeast Syria, where does the technology come from? It comes from the US, Europe, NATO countries. When they say that they're doing this because they're fighting terrorism, who is it that gives them the justification for doing that? It's the fact that, well, oh, the United States lists the PKK as a terrorist organization. Oh, Europe lists the PKK as a terrorist organization. Why is it that the politicians in Northeast Syria, the leaders who have built this system, aren't able to even so much as go to some countries, travel on the international stage, be evenly heard in the media? It's because Turkey criminalizes them, criminalizes their narratives, makes it so that these countries, you know, that support Turkey and have these military and security relationships take the same position on even these completely legal civilian political efforts as Turkey does. So ending our government's complicity and support for this war would be one very important thing that could be done to ultimately push Turkey to realize that it's been 100 years. No efforts to resolve the Kurdish question by force have succeeded. All it has led to is massive civilian suffering, political repression, and even authoritarianism impacting not only Kurds, but all people in Turkey right now, particularly the opposition, particularly the left, particularly minorities. This is not working out for anyone. It is most certainly not working out for the people of Northeast Syria and their revolutionary project, but it's not working out for anyone else either. Only a political solution is the way out, and all of us can play a part in doing what we can to make that happen so that North and East Syria has the space that it needs to develop and thrive.
Thank you, Megan, for that comprehensive and critical intervention about the new social contract and the developments in the region. I would like to, before we open up the floor for Q&A, I'd like to highlight your point on the regional local right of referendum that's been coming with this newer version of the social contract, because not only because it seems like a appropriate and effective way of addressing this questions of regional variation to the degree of which the social contract had been applied previously. You know, we've had some discussions within the ECR before about why certain principles weren't really like applied on the ground in certain parts under the autonomous administration's control, such as Raqqa, such as Deir ez-Zor. So from a governance reform point of view, I think it's really crucial, this point of uh, regional local right of referendum, but not only for that reason, not only for that sort of internal reason, but also I think it reflects something about trends in social mobilization in the 21st century, particularly grassroots autonomous movements, because around the same time that the new social contract was ratified recently, a similar movement from a different part of the world, the EZLN, the Zapatistas, also had some restructuring of their own, where they got rid of middle-level caracoles, you know, mid-level of their administration scheme. So I think these changes and debates also show trends in grassroots mobilization in the 21st century and people's sort of trial and error process, and through experience, through doing this sort of slow walk towards a just, more dignified life. So not only it's significant in terms of Rojava's internal dynamics and the different degrees to which the revolutionary project can be implemented, but also what these changes say about resistance and the struggle for justice overall in the world. So thank you for your contribution, and I'm sure our participants were as excited as I were and have some questions for you. So let's open up the floor for any questions for our speaker, Megan. Anyone interested in clarifying anything, asking a question?
Yeah, I mean, while we wait for questions to come in, I'll say that you bring up the local right of referendum and then the uneven sort of implementation of different laws. One of the reasons why people in Northeast Syria felt that they needed a new social contract was because the previous system was a very patchwork system where you had certain laws and structures in the 3 original cantons, then something different in Manbij and something different in Raqqa, and then Deir ez-Zor is doing something different out on its own over there. And so standardizing this, putting everything under one system with one set of expectations and principles and structures was one of the reasons why they did this. And one of the things that's in the social contract when it comes to the right of referendum is the fact that these local decisions aren't able to contradict the basic principles of the social contract, which is the section that includes all of the principles about, gender equality, pluralism, basic values like that. And, when a specific example of this, for example, in the three original cantons of Northeast Syria, Kobani, Afrin, and Jazeera, polygamy is banned. So men can't marry more than one woman. In Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor and Manbij, when the autonomous administration originally got there was so much opposition to a ban on polygamy, not only from men, but actually from a lot of conservative women as well, that they weren't able to enforce a law like that. But over the years since the victory over ISIS, due to the work of local women's institutions, for example, when I was in Manbij, they were telling me that although polygamy isn't illegal, if a woman comes to them and says that her husband wants to take a second wife and that she doesn't want that, they might meet with the family, sit down, try to convince the husband not to marry another woman, explain why it's bad for their marriage, explain why it's bad for their children, and try to make the case, to talk them out of it without going to the legal system. And they've said that they've been successful in a lot of these cases. So while they're doing that, you're hearing from a lot of these women, in Manbij and Raqqa, the very active women in the women's institutions, they feel like they're ready to have legal protections to back them up. I think that there have been different perspectives on that, with some people wanting more top-down legal action, people wanting more bottom-up social education. In my personal view, I think being able to extend those laws on, the basic rights of women and girls to the entire region would be a step that's very important. I think that, hearing that from women in these communities, was something that was very important, to know that they want to do this themselves. And interestingly enough, in the social contract, in the section on the establishment of the Women's Council of Northeast Syria, which is sort of the parallel autonomous women's structure to the overall administration that will be established, one of the things that this all women's parallel autonomous elected body, which is supposed to be, according to the social contract, actually elected by the women of Northeast Syria. So there'll be, I don't know, all women's elections for the Women's Council. That's a very interesting procedure that they'll figure out when they get to that point. One of the tasks of the Women's Council is going to be creating laws to regulate women's rights and issues relating to women in Northeast Syria. So that means there's a potential that the specific laws on, marriage, divorce, personal status, that sort of equalized women's legal status in the three original cantons of Northeast Syria that haven't been able to be implemented yet in more socially conservative areas that spent longer under ISIS rule, that might change and that these laws might spread. So this might be an area where we see sort of the expansion of this women's liberationist component of the revolution. And this sort of model of direct democracy by referendum, where people in a town can choose, people in a city can choose to disagree with the autonomous administration. From what I'm seeing in the social contract and from my conversations with people, that's not going to mean that one administrative unit can disagree with principles on something like women's rights, on something like, the equality of all ethnic groups, all religious groups, things like that. So continuing to maintain those tensions and deal with, these aren't problems that are going to go away. These tensions, these issues are going to exist. But it looks like with the social contract, they're showing that they've expanded some of the ideas to more communities, and that they want to, do as much as they can to expand these revolutionary ideas while also giving people with different perspectives, different communities with different views, the ability to dissent, when they want to dissent. So that's how I see that.
Thank you. I see we have some questions in the chat box so far, but I also see that they've been answered by fellow comrades, so thank you for that. And yeah, the floor is open to any other questions by our participants.
I have a question. that maybe it was sort of just answered, but as I was reading through the document, it struck me as like by and large mostly in line with a sort of, to be fair, very progressive parliamentary democracy, as I am familiar with parliamentary democracies elsewhere in the world. Um, and I guess the the question is like, is there a concise way to explain um, how this is anti-statist, how this is like um, something new, something different? Is that something that's sort of um, cultural in the region and has to do with other institutions that are not the autonomous administration? Is that something that you can sort of point to some piece of the and I guess that there was this piece about local referendums uh, overruling federal law, which is like does seem different. Is there, I guess, is there anything besides that, or is there like something fundamental in the document that uh, I missed, or is it just sort of a cultural and political ethos that's being, yeah.
Yeah, that's an awesome question. So I think that, first of all, in their efforts to be anti-nation statist, it's heavier on the nation part than the state part in a lot of ways, because I think that when you are not only at war, but at war against, the second largest army in NATO, a vastly military superior adversary, there's economic crises, there's all of these pressures that, we know historically force things like centralization and decision making, even when ideologically people might, in an ideal world, not want to do that. It's hard to get away from that there. I think honestly, given the pressures that they're under, the fact that they're committed to these ideas at all, is very, very impressive. But that's a shortcoming because they say themselves that they want to, change this and move in that other direction. I think that in the context of the region, where we see states built on, the supremacy of one ethnicity, one religion, not just the region, if you look at the process of forming the modern nation state all over the world, this has always been how this is done. The fact that they are so insistent on, pluralism in terms of representing all of the different communities who live in Syria, I think is something in the regional context that's very important. If you look at the procedures for how these elected bodies will be, construed as well, you'll see that 60% of the members of each elected body will be, directly elected by the people, in the way of a traditional parliamentary democracy. But the other 40% are chosen by different, social and political institutions in the administration by their members' own internal processes. So this is things like Congress Star, the Zenobia Women's Assembly, TEVDEM, the social political institutions, the institutions for different religious groups, so on and so forth, women's institutions, which are, set up in a different way, which are made up of, all of the people of any given constituency who choose to join them, which have their own, collective internal processes for determining, who they send to these higher levels, what work they do. That's sort of that more traditional model that Northeast Syria has had for a longer period of time, based on, the participation of everyone who wants to participate, not necessarily everybody voting in an election. So those institutions are still going to exist, and they're still going to be able to choose who they send to these elected bodies. One interesting sort of, again, tension or contradiction that you see here is one of the reasons that was, put forward by a lot of people for this move towards, standardizing elections and elected bodies at different levels, was the fact that many people, due to the pressures of the conflict, the very difficult economic situation, living through 12 years of war, getting active, engaged political participation in every neighborhood commune simply wasn't something that was happening all the time. Honestly, a lot of people have bigger issues than, revolutionary politics, when they're worried about, when I send my kids to school, is a drone, going to hit their school? Are they going to be okay? Do we have enough money to put food on the table? Can we heat our homes? Can we turn the lights on? These very existential day-to-day issues that people are dealing with make it difficult to get that level of participation, particularly among communities where the project is new, that haven't been, committed supporters of this movement for a very long time. And so a system with elections is something where, it's obviously easier to vote every 2 years or every 4 years or what have you than it is to participate every day on a day-to-day basis. And so that was one of the tensions that was being contended with, was how do you make a representative participatory system when the people who you want to participate are saying or showing in their behavior that participating every day isn't something that they feel like they can do. And again, this goes back to the constraints of the security situation. We don't know what the communes would look like, or the elections would look like, or any of these institutions would look like if they weren't under these drones and F-16s every day. If there was a functioning economy, if Syria wasn't being, the Syrian people weren't being sanctioned, which, by the way, a lot of people look at these sanctions on Syria and they think, oh, well, they've lifted them on the Northeast. It's just against the regime, whatever. The Syrian regime is doing fine. They have Russia. Somebody asked in the chat who's supporting the Syrian government. Russia is, Iran is. They have allies. Their elites are not, impacted by these sanctions at all. It's just regular Syrian people in all parts of Syria, controlled by the government, by the opposition, by the SDF, by any group. It's the civilians who are suffering. They're already poor because of this conflict, and the sanctions on Syria are making things worse. So again, another useful thing to advocate for is ending all sanctions on Syria that are impacting the Syrian people, and trying to make it easier to do not just humanitarian aid, but actual reconstruction and rebuilding. So I think just given the realities of the situation there, some of the changes that have been made that have made it, more parliamentary in that regard are actually based on the behavior and preferences of the people. But at the same time, these participatory structures that have existed since the beginning of the revolution, they're still there, they're not going away. And the new social contract gives them a role in having representatives who will participate, in these parliamentary institutions. And not all of the politics of Northeast Syria is going to be done in these legislative institutions, right? If there is a law and let's say the women's movement disagrees with it, they're going to protest. They're going to take to the streets. They've done that before. They've gotten the outcomes of court cases changed. People are still going to demonstrate. People are still going to meet in their communities. The communes and local level institutions, those are still going to exist. And again, if we see more peace, more stability, an end to the really devastating security and economic pressures on these regions, those institutions might thrive even more. So that would be what I would say.
I see a question in the chat box by Debbie. A fabulous presentation, Meghan. Thank you so much. In addition to publishing a new social contract in the principal languages of the region, do you know if there are going to be any efforts to actively educate people about it so as to fully engage people and get buy-in from communities that were not actively covered previously?
So yeah, my understanding is that they will be, through different autonomous administration institutions, working to explain the new social contract to the public, everywhere that they can. I don't know if that's being done now, because I think honestly, they're more worried about keeping everybody inside and following security protocols so that people are not killed or injured in Turkish bombardment. And I think that after that, the priority is things like getting the electricity back on, getting people fuel so they can heat their homes, getting the water stations back up and running. So I think that certainly the plan in terms of what they've been trying to do, and what I imagine that to some extent, if maybe lessened, they still will do, is to explain what's in the social contract to the public. Obviously, if they're going to hold elections, that will all have to be explained as well, because it'll be the first time. That's one of the steps that I think is, they're requiring sort of time for preparation as they plan to hold these elections, is not just coming up with the entire institutional structure of how to do it and resources for how to do it, but time to explain to people what they're going to do and how people should best participate. So that's something that's going to happen, that's already been happening. And through the consultations to create the social contract, certainly people have had the opportunity to hear about it to some degree already. So that is certainly something that's being planned.
And to piggyback and complement your response, as far as I know, if I'm not mistaken, not after the first wave of attacks, but after the second wave of aerial attacks, the autonomous administration also declared a sort of specific state of emergency. There was already a state of emergency in place, but at least the offices of the autonomous administration were still in service. However, over the past 10 days or so, over the past 2 weeks since the second wave of attacks, only emergency service providing organizations are open. So some of the offices of the autonomous administration have also unfortunately been closed. Only the ones providing, critical emergency services like firefighting, etc., are open. So it'll probably take a brief amount of time before the autonomous administration can sort of stand back up on its feet.
Yeah, I mean, if there are drones in the sky, you can't, you don't go outside. And getting the level of infrastructural damage, from what I understand, is something that's not capable of being fixed without outside support. And as I think you said, one thing that Turkey has been doing is bombing the same site multiple times. So, waiting until first responders are there, or even, in the different airstrike campaigns, they'll bomb something and people will go out and fix it and it'll work for a month. And then a month later, they bomb it again. And it's just forcing all of this use of resources into something that's just being destroyed over and over again.
Seems we have a couple of questions in the chat box. And York asks, what would the women of Rojava would ask us, would tell us, want us to know or to do, other than stopping the US NATO war machine, is one question. And there's another question about sort of like the lack of general understanding of events in the region in England. So if you'd like to respond to any of these 2 points.
That was me asking that question about England. And I live in London, and I only became aware of anything that had been happening in northeast Syria in October last year. And I'm fairly plugged in politically, feminist-wise, and I was really shocked that this had not come to my attention in any way. So there is a spectacularly effective media blanket going on. And since I discovered it, I have been speaking to pretty much everybody I know, going, did you know that this has happened? And nobody knows. And I'm coming from a left-wing activist community. I was at a Julian Assange protest this afternoon. I'm at things a lot. So that shows me how this project is perceived as being extraordinarily dangerous by the states in the globe. And it seems clear that Turkey is being used to undermine the project. And and that all sides, both NATO and there's so many investments in undermining both the autonomy in Mexico and in Syria that I think one of the most important things is to have people hear about it, because more people know about it, the less able you are to kind of blow it off the face of the earth. Currently, that isn't happening. So, I mean, I think with the new social contract, it's a really good opportunity to filter it out into these communities, into the alternative political communities, the anarchist community, that it's not in. And why is it not in there? How has this been so effectively hidden when it is actually, as I start looking into it, yes, all the people who are very much plugged into the internationalist movement are aware of it, but people on the peripherals aren't. And it would seem to me that raising awareness at this point would be really crucial. And that same thing about the atrocities being committed by Turkey, which is what they are. They're hardly acts of war, because it can only be called a war if somebody's attacking you back. It's not a war when you just go and bomb civilians. That's not a war. That's a war crime. And these are, again, completely invisible in the media. And I would say that crisis, that radio silence that is happening, is something that has to be addressed with some level of urgency. I mean, and I've found it, what I've done is put together a pile of links on notes, which I send to everybody. I say, there's been a revolution in northeast Syria. Do you know about it? And they say, no, I don't know anything about it. And then I send them a pile of links. And which is like tiny and spectacularly ineffective. But I think the new social contract could be used along with the appalling attacks in Turkey to raise awareness, which I think awareness is, people in the rest of the world are desperate. Most people can't even conceive of the concept of a non-state nation. The state is so ubiquitous in all of our minds that a couple of occasions when I've explained to somebody the concept, they've gone, you can see them taking a step back, going, hang on a minute, I never even thought such a thing was possible. So I think it's like a beautiful dream that's going on that really, really needs more telling on a much bigger scale, and how, I have no idea. That's what I've got to say. Maybe you have ideas.
I mean, I think you answered your own question, and I don't want you or anybody else on here to ever call anything that you do spectacularly ineffective, because it's not. Because if even one person hears about Northeast Syria and what's going on and, chooses to help in any way that they can, that's something that matters. That's very effective. And telling your friends, family, comrades, coworkers, whoever hey, there's a revolution going on, you should hear about it, is one of the most effective things that every single one of us can be doing. Raising awareness, I agree. Getting it out in the media, any media, no platform is too small or too specific to a certain audience. In fact, specific audiences are really good because you can reach out to them with aspects of the situation in Northeast Syria that might appeal to them, that they might find valuable, that they might want to show solidarity with, and making sure that people hear about it, because you can't do anything about it if you don't know what's going on. So again, I think you answered your own questions there in terms of the importance of awareness, building connections with your networks, getting the media talking about it, getting the groups you participate in talking about it. So, and this new social contract, just showing what they're doing, is something that, is a great way to do that as well. So I agree there. And then we also had someone ask about, what the women of Rojava would ask us or tell us, or what we want to do. I wish we could have some of them on this call right now. It's unfortunately the middle of the night in Syria. And I know that ECR has done And, you know, groups that are affiliated with ECR have done some great interviews with people there. But I'll tell you, for a piece that I'm working on the social contract, I interviewed Fawza Yousaf, who, you know, is with the leadership of the PYD, a very, very powerful and very experienced woman, you know, who's incredibly committed to the revolutionary project of Northeast Syria as a whole and to the women's movement overall. You know, has been many, many years in making that a reality. She's someone who, you know, it's interesting. Every book, I think, that's touched on the social contract has interviewed her about it, you know, in Daughters of Kobani, in a book called Statelet of Survivors by Amy Austin Holmes that recently came out that's got a good overview of the social contract. You know, everybody goes to her. And so I asked her, I said, look, you know, what is your message to the international community here? You know, what do you need the world to know? And her main points were that, you know, this is what the people of North and East Syria have decided on. And that the world, if they want to see, you know, peace, stability, security in Northeast Syria, they have to respect that this is what these people want, that the people of Northeast Syria are going to move ahead and build it and implement it no matter what anybody does. And that, you know, in order to create, you know, an end to these conflicts, an end to these crises in the region, that there should be support for the implementation of this document. And so I think, you know, based on what I heard from her, creating the conditions, doing everything we can to make it possible for the people of Northeast Syria to develop their revolution, implement this new social contract, continue to build their ideas, that's the most important thing that we can do. In that, you know, these demands that would make that possible are something that you're seeing in a lot of calls from the autonomous administration, from the women's movement, from different institutions, you know, getting an end to the violence now, getting assistance in, you know, to rebuild and make it so that they can restore the capabilities that have been damaged in these strikes, a political solution to Turkey's, you know, unresolved Kurdish question, a return to negotiations, some kind of just democratic political settlement that protects the rights of the Kurdish people. This is not, you know, Rojava specific, but one thing that has been going on overall is, you know, Kurdish communities and organizations and a lot of their international allies, you know, in Europe, in Latin America, in Africa, really all over the world, launched a campaign last October calling for freedom for Abdullah Öcalan, who's the founder and leader of the PKK. Now, if you're looking at these ideas, you know, if you know a little bit about Northeast Syria, you'll recognize that a lot of these principles about decentralization, women's liberation, pluralism, rejecting the nation state, this comes from Öcalan's philosophy. What a lot of people don't realize is that part of the inspiration behind his writings and the Kurdish movement switch to these ideas was their, you know, decades spent in the society of Northeast Syria, you know, working there, meeting with the community, organizing there. They knew that society very well, and the society of Northeast Syria had a big impact on them. So these ideas, you know, they're part of this revolutionary tradition, and there's something that, you know, because of the role that they play there, you know, we see that they work, we see that they're important, we see that they're critical to, you know, democracy, peace, stability, all of these things that, you know, this region and so much of the world is lacking in. But unfortunately, for the past, you know, nearly 3 years, Öcalan obviously has been in prison for almost 25 years now. And for these past 3 years, he's not been able to communicate with his family or his lawyers at all. This is a big deal. You know, the Kurdish movement and many, many Kurds, you know, in Kurdish communities across the region see him as their chief negotiator were there ever to be a peace process. We know, you know, in his last meetings with his legal team, he said that Turkey's issues with Northeast Syria should be resolved peacefully through a framework that protects the rights of the Kurds, you know, and democratization within, you know, the existing borders of Syria. All of these are messages that are very important. And, you know, the fact that he's not being allowed to communicate, you know, in violation of Turkish law and international law is something that is just pouring fuel on the fire of this conflict. So supporting that campaign for, you know, freedom for Öcalan, a political solution for the Kurdish question, there's lots of different ways to get involved there, whether that's demonstrations, talking about it, writing an op-ed in your local paper, anything you can do, that's going to matter, because resolving the Kurdish issue at the source in Turkey is the only thing that at the end of the day is going to stop these attacks on northeast Syria. And, allowing Öcalan to communicate, continue to share his ideas and, make these statements is something that could be a very important, tangible step towards getting negotiations on track.
Again, to piggyback, I'd like to add something. Thank you for all the wonderful questions. Before we wrap up soon, I wanted to address a point Nonika mentioned. We share your frustration with the lack of awareness on the developments in northeast Syria and the revolutionary project that's been built there. And this is why we started ECR about 7 years ago, to create more awareness and more sensitivity about the developments in northeast Syria, in North America as well as Europe. So please continue following us, coming to our monthly meetings. We have reading group meetings every month or so, as well as the general organizing meetings. And we have different working groups within the ECR that work on specific issues, ranging from the Freedom for Öcalan campaign to Women's Autonomous Mobilization. So, come join our monthly meetings, come join our special group meetings. And I see a similar related question about, is there any way we can in the chat box, is there any way we can organize or find each other to put together local actions regarding these demands? Well, although ECR operates at the national level in the United States, we do have clusters where we put up local actions, and you can, join the preparation of those actions through participation in the general listserv, in the general monthly meetings. To give an example, a couple months ago in Sacramento, we did a joint event with Sacramento DSA about Michael Israel, who was a YPG martyr who fell in Rojava in 2016, I believe. So there are some local actions like that you can get involved too. Just make sure to come to our monthly organizing meetings and join our WhatsApp messaging group and follow our social media. I would like to end my comment with a brief related announcement on a visual explainer sort of primer that we're working on. As ECR, we want to popularize the new social contract in the Western hemisphere, in the Western audiences. So we're in the process of working with a new visual explainer, that's going to be accessible and sort of grabbing the attention of, readers, especially uninformed readers. So if you have any experience in terms of both visual design, but also writing written content for this project, which would, echo some of the conversations we had tonight about the new social contract, please send us an email at info@defendrojava.org. I'm also copying and pasting this address in the chat box again for your access, and we will add you to the relevant WhatsApp chat group so you can help us prepare this visual explainer as well.
And I've also put my email in there. If anybody has more questions and you think I can answer them, I will try my best. If I can't answer them, I will try my best to connect you to somebody who can.
I believe we have Arthur up next.
Thanks, Emily. I just wanted to take this moment to also give a brief spoiler alert of an exciting announcement, which will be coming out in a more kind of official way soon. But for those on the call, especially those on the call who live on the East Coast, we want everybody to know that we're working on putting together an in-person demonstration in Washington, D.C., calling for the freedom of Abdullah Öcalan on February 15th. And we would absolutely love to have you come out if you're in the area, or if you are able to travel to the area, if you can spread the word in your community, amongst your friends, your comrades, your colleagues. It's deeply appreciated. But like I said, stay tuned for a more sort of formal announcement. But while we had everybody together, it felt important to mention that. We also have some other exciting plans for the year, and we look forward to chatting more about that soon. So make sure you're on the email list, like Emre says, or WhatsApp chat. You can direct message either one of us with like your email or phone number if you want to make sure right now that it doesn't slip through the cracks. But stay in touch. Thanks.
It seems like a sort of natural end to our gathering with the exchange of contact information. But before we wrap up, I'd like to ask, are there any remaining questions, comments for our speaker, Meghan, today? If not, thank you all for your time today. Thank you all for tuning in, and make sure to keep following us and coming to our events to get further information on the developments in the region, but also to, share your solidarity with the revolution in Rojava. Thank you, and have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you. It was really great and really informative. You will see me again.
Looking forward to it.
Thanks so much, everybody. Thank you, Megan. Solidarity, y'all.
Thanks, guys.